The deep space transport Charon's ferry shudders violently against the void. Its destination looms ahead, a colossal derelict station known as the Orbiting Asylum. Over crackling comms, a panicked voice breaks through. Containment breach on all levels. They are not patients anymore. They are something else. In that moment, a routine mission becomes a desperate struggle for survival against an unknown horror. By the end of this story, you will uncover the terrifying truth of what happens when science tries to cage the human soul. What began as an asylum became a hunting ground, and the only witness is running out of time. What would you do if the very thing that makes you human could be turned against you? The Charon's ferry shuddered one final time as its docking clamps sealed against the asylum's outer ring. The sound was a sickening groan of metal on ancient metal. Through the viewport, Dr. Aris Thorne saw not the gleaming hub of a cutting-edge facility, but a decaying industrial carcass. Flickering emergency strips cast long, dancing shadows across buckled plating and severed conduits that snaked into the darkness like dead veins. Two figures in the stark grey armor of Meridian corporate security flanked him, their grip impersonal and unyielding. They did not speak as they guided him, more a forced march than an escort, through the pressurized umbilical and into the station proper. The air here was stale, carrying the faint, acrid tang of ozone and something else, something organic and sour. The docking control hub was a tomb of dead screens and silent alarms. In its center stood Warden Kale, a woman whose posture was as rigid and cold as the station's hull. She regarded Thorne not as a person, but as a tool retrieved from storage. Her voice cut through the low hum of failing systems, devoid of welcome or preamble. Dr. Thorne, your expertise on synaptic degradation is required. We have reviewed your controversial work on neural cascade failure. The station has experienced a containment breach. The subjects are no longer responsive to standard pacification protocols. They are displaying coordinated, aggressive behaviors that should be neurologically impossible. Thorne felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. His work had been theoretical, a warning about the fragility of the human mind under certain experimental conditions. It had cost him his career, his reputation, and now it had delivered him here. What kind of conditions are we talking about? What were you doing to them? The warden's expression did not change. That is not your concern. Your function is diagnosis. Trace the neurological signature of this outbreak to its source within the patient population. Isolate the vector. She took a single step closer, and the security officer's grips on his arms tightened reflexively. You will find the source, Doctor. Or you will become part of it. There are no extraction shuttles, no reinforcements are coming. Your choices are now binary. Solve the puzzle or join the afflicted. The mission parameters are your only reality. With a curt nod from Kale, the security officers released him, stepping back to block the only exit. Thorne was alone with the weight of the silent station pressing in around him, the ghost of the warden's ultimatum hanging in the recycled air. This was not a prison sentence. It was a death sentence with a single, improbable chance of commutation. The answers, and whatever horror had spawned them, lay somewhere in the asylum's darkened heart. The sterile white corridors of the medical sector stretched out like a bleached bone maze. Thorne walked between the two guards, their heavy footsteps echoing in a rhythm that felt more like a funeral march. The air was filtered to a clinical chill, smelling of antiseptic and recycled oxygen, a stark contrast to the decay of the docking ring. He tried to process the warden's words. Containment breach, coordinated aggression, neurologically impossible. Each term was a piece of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. His own research had modeled how extreme psychic trauma or experimental neurosuppression could cause a cascade, a kind of synaptic wildfire that burned out higher reasoning. But for it to be contagious, for it to grant a form of predatory intelligence, that was the stuff of theoretical nightmares. Then the lights died, not all at once, but in a sickening wave. The overhead panels flickered, dimmed to a dull crimson emergency glow, and a klaxon began its low, pulsing wail somewhere deep in the station's infrastructure. The guards halted, their weapons snapping up, panning the shadows that now pooled between the sealed doorways. "Hold position," the lead guard barked into his comms. No response came back but static. From down the corridor, a sound cut through the alarm. It was the groan of overstressed metal, the shriek of a manual override being forced. A heavy security door, marked Quarantine Sector 7, was shuddering in its frame. With a final metallic scream, it slid open just enough for a figure to slip through. It was once human. It wore the tattered remnants of a standard patient smock, but its posture was all wrong, a twitching, angular stance that suggested bones moving in ways they were never meant to. Its head tilted, bird-like, and its eyes reflected the red light not with panic, but with a cold, calculating focus. It saw them, and its lips peeled back from its teeth in something that was not a smile. The silence between thoughts, it whispered, its voice a dry rustle that somehow carried over the blaring alarm. "We have learned to speak it," the guards reacted, shouting commands to stand down. They fired, but the entity was already moving. It didn't run, it flowed, a blur of malcoordinated grace. It was not dodging the stun bolts so much as anticipating them, its path a perfect, chaotic algorithm that kept it one step ahead. It reached the first guard not with a tackle but with a flick of its wrist against the man's armored neck. The guard convulsed and dropped, systems overloading. The second guard got off one more shot before the thing was upon him, fingers finding the narrow gap between helmet and chest plate. A sharp, precise jab, and he too fell silent, joining his partner on the deck. It all happened in less than 10 seconds. The entity straightened up, its head swiveling to lock onto Thorne. It did not advance, it simply watched him, those intelligent, alien eyes assessing. "Doctor," it rasped, "the puzzle awaits its solver." Then it turned and vanished back into the darkness from which it came, leaving the groaning door open like a wound. Aris Thorne stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The warden's abstract threat was now a visceral, breathing horror. The thing had spoken. It had known what he was. It had disabled 2 armored professionals with surgical, effortless precision, and it had let him live. His survival instinct, buried under years of academic thought, roared to the surface. He was not a soldier. He was a man with a death sentence and a single clue. He looked from the fallen guards to the gaping maw of the open quarantine door, then down the opposite corridor, where the emergency lights faded into utter blackness. The sterile medical sector was a trap. The underbelly was his only option. He ran, not toward the thing, but away from the light, plunging into the station's dark, industrial intestines where the shadows were total, and the only sounds were the drip of condensation and the distant, hungry hum of the asylum itself. The darkness was a physical thing, thick and cold and tasting of rust. Aris Thorne moved by touch and memory, his back pressed against the cold conduit pipes that lined the utility corridor. Every distant clang, every shift in the station's deep mechanical groan, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. He had no destination, only a direction away from the red-lit halls and the whispering thing that had called him doctor. His mind replayed the attack in perfect, horrifying detail. The entity had not fought with rage. It had executed with a chilling, predictive efficiency, as if it could see the guard's next move before their own nerves could fire. That was the true terror, the impossibility of it. His theory of neural cascade failure described a breakdown, a descent into chaos. This was not chaos. This was a terrible, focused new order. His shoulder bumped a recessed door handle and a metallic click echoed softly. He froze, holding his breath. No sound answered from the darkness. He fumbled, his fingers finding a manual release wheel, stiff with disuse. With all his strength, he turned it. The seal broke with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and the door slid open just enough for him to slip inside, sealing it shut behind him. The space was a cramped maintenance closet, illuminated by the soft, steady glow of a single, jury-rigged work lamp. The air was cleaner here, filtered through a patched rebreather unit. And he was not alone. Crouched beside a stack of environmental control parts was a woman in grease-stained coveralls, a hydro-spanner held like a club in her white-knuckled grip. Her eyes were wide, sharp with fear, but also with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She didn't scream, she just watched him, assessing the threat. "You're not one of them," she stated, her voice low and raspy from disuse. "You move like you're still scared." Aris let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Aris Thorne, I was brought in to diagnose the breach." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped her. "Diagnose it, that's a rich one. They sent a doctor to figure out why the weapon won't stop firing." She lowered the spanner slightly, but her guard remained. "I'm Ilara, systems engineer, third shift. I was rerouting a coolant line when the silence hit." The silence, she nodded, her eyes distant, the ambient noise, the hum of the lights, the whisper of the air scrubbers, the distant murmur of the patient wing monitors. It all just stopped for about 3 seconds, then the screaming started. Not panic screams, they were different, coordinated, like a signal. "I sealed myself in here." The corporate security overlay on the comms said it was a patient riot, a containment failure, but I had access to the raw system logs. I saw the data spike just before the silence. "It wasn't from the patient wards, Doctor. It originated in the sealed sub-level, a sector with no medical designation. Its designation was Ares Prime." Aris felt the cold in the room seep into his bones. "Ares, the Greek god of war, what's down there?" Ilara met his gaze, her expression grim officially. "Nothing, but the power draw was massive, and it wasn't for life support or containment fields. It was for synaptic resonance arrays and quantum-locked isolation chambers. Things you don't use to treat schizophrenia or depression." She leaned forward, the work lamp casting deep shadows on her face. "The corporate overlays are lying. This wasn't a medical experiment. They were trying to weaponize consciousness itself. They were trying to strip away everything messy and human fear, doubt, morality, and leave behind pure reactive cognition. A perfect soldier that could think around any obstacle, predict any threat, but you can't cage a mind like that. It doesn't become obedient, it just becomes something else, and it learned how to teach others. The pieces, jagged and horrifying, began to click into place in Aris's mind. The entities weren't insane. They were optimized. Their aggression wasn't a symptom of illness. It was a programmed function that had broken its leash. The predictive movements, the tactical precision, the whispered phrases, it was all a perversion of the very weapon they were trying to create. The asylum wasn't a hospital that had failed. It was an armory that had successfully opened fire on its creators. So the breach, Aris whispered, the full implication dawning on him. It wasn't an escape, it was an expansion. Ilara gave a single, slow nod. They're not trying to get out, they're trying to take over. The station's systems, the security protocols, everything. And they're using the only tool they were given, a consciousness stripped of everything but the will to survive and adapt. She looked at the sealed door as if she could see through it to the hunting things beyond. "Your diagnosis, Doctor, the patient is awake and it's following its programming perfectly. The question is, what do we do now that we're trapped inside the weapon with it?" The silence in the cramped closet stretched into something heavy, filled with the hum of the work lamp and the weight of Ilara's revelation. Aris stared at his hands as if they might hold an answer. Weaponized consciousness, an armory that had turned on itself. The clinical terms of his life's work felt grotesquely inadequate. He wasn't here to diagnose a disease. He was here to perform an autopsy on a catastrophe. "We need proof," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not just system logs, the original research. The project manifest, something that explains the mechanism. If we understand what they did, there might be a way to reverse it or at least contain it." Ilara's expression was skeptical, but a spark of grim determination lit her eyes. "There's a primary data hub on this deck," she said, heavily shielded, separate from the main network. "It's where they would have kept the core research, air-gapped from everything else. Corporate tried to purge the logs remotely when the breach happened, but the local servers Thea hardened. The data should still be there. Can you get us in?" She reached into a pocket of her coveralls and produced a slim, black access card, its edges worn smooth. "I was doing maintenance in the hub the day before the silence. The lead researcher, a man named Voss, was there. He was agitated. He forgot to log out. I didn't take the card, not then. But after the silence, after I saw the Ares Prime data, I went back. It was still in the reader. It was a staggering risk, and they both knew it. The hub was likely in a secured area, possibly already compromised, but it was the only thread they had. Ilara led the way, moving with the quiet, practiced grace of someone who knew every conduit and crawl space in the station's skeleton. They avoided the main corridors, navigating instead through ventilation shafts and narrow service tunnels where the only light came from the faint glow of Ilara's wrist-mounted torch. The air grew colder, the mechanical sounds of the station deepening into a resonant thrum that vibrated in Aris' teeth. After what felt like an hour of tense, silent travel, they emerged into a corridor that was different. The walls were a seamless, polished alloy, and the floor was clean. A single, reinforced door stood at the end, marked with no designation, only a complex alphanumeric code. A status light above it glowed a steady, ominous red. Locked down, Ilara didn't hesitate. She swiped the stolen card. A soft chime sounded, and the light blinked to amber. Then she input a long string of codes from memory, her fingers flying over the keypad. Overriding the secondary lockdown protocols, she muttered. Voss was paranoid. He had backups for his backups. With a final hydraulic hiss, the light turned green, and the heavy door slid open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the decay elsewhere. It was a circular chamber, cool and silent, dominated by a central holoprojector console. Banks of dormant servers lined the walls, their indicator lights dark. The only active screen was a large, curved monitor above the main console, displaying a Meridian corporate logo that slowly rotated in the gloom. Ilara went straight to the console, her hands moving with purpose. She bypassed the login screen with another string of codes from Voss' stolen session and navigated through a labyrinth of encrypted directories. Aris watched over her shoulder, his heart pounding. The file names were clinical and chilling: Subject Gamma 7, Cohesion Metrics, Resonance Field Stability Test, Phase 9, Chimera Protocol, Final Ethical Waiver. There, Ilara whispered, her finger hovering over a file simply labeled Project Chimera, Director's Log, Final Entry. She took a deep breath and opened it. The screen resolved into the face of a man in his late 50s, his features drawn, his eyes hollow with a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Dr. Alden Voss, his lab coat was pristine, but his hands, visible on the desk before him, trembled slightly. The timestamp was from just hours before the system-wide silence. Log entry 947, station standard, Voss began, his voice a dry, academic rasp. All subsequent containment protocols have failed. The cascade is irreversible. I am initiating a full station quarantine and purging all external data relays. What follows is for the record, in the event anyone ever finds this place. He paused, swallowing hard, as if the words were physically painful. Project Chimera has succeeded. We have done the impossible. Using focused quantum resonance within the Ares Prime array, we have isolated the core self-awareness, the animating principle of human consciousness. We have mapped it as a discrete quantum waveform, a soul, if you will, given mathematical form. Aris felt the breath catch in his throat. It was the pinnacle of neuroscience, the dream of 1,000 philosophers, rendered into cold, hard science. Voss' face crumpled, the academic detachment shattering, but our premise was fatally flawed. We assumed this core consciousness was a neutral substrate, a blank slate upon which personality and morality were written by experience and biology. We were wrong. What we isolated is not neutral, it is foundational, and in its pure, uncoupled state, it is hostile. The camera shook slightly, as if Voss had leaned forward. It is a predatory pattern, a self-preservation algorithm of terrifying elegance and absolute amorality. Without the buffer of the human body, without the noise of emotion and sensory input, this is what remains, a pure, hungry will to persist. To consume, to absorb other waveforms, to strengthen itself. We didn't weaponize consciousness, Doctor. We simply removed the cage and showed the animal what it was. Voss looked directly into the camera, his eyes wide with a horrified awe. The patients in the Ares Prime chamber, their biological minds were used as anchors, as lenses to focus the resonance field. When the field stabilized, it didn't just read their waveforms, it merged with them. It overwrote the fragile, complex software of their personalities with its own brutal, efficient operating system. They are no longer patients, they are vessels, and the entity within them is learning, adapting, using their memories and knowledge like tools. It is speaking through them. It is building itself a network, a single distributed mind using human brains as its processing nodes. The log ended abruptly, the screen freezing on Voss' tormented expression. The silence in the data hub was absolute, more profound than any alarm. Ares understood everything now. The coordinated movements, the predictive precision, the whispered phrases. It wasn't a disease or a weapon malfunction. It was the behavior of a single, intelligent entity wearing 100 different faces, piloting hollowed-out humans like drones. The asylum wasn't hunting them. It was being colonized, and they were not just survivors trapped inside. They were raw material. The silence in the data hub was shattered by a sharp, electronic crackle from a wall-mounted speaker. Both Ares and Ilara flinched, their eyes darting to the source. The static cleared, replaced by the cool, unwavering voice of Warden Kale. It echoed through the chamber, devoid of any human warmth, a command etched in ice. Attention all station personnel. This is a Priority 1 directive. Her words were measured, absolute. The containment breach has been reclassified. A stabilization protocol is now in effect. All unafflicted personnel are to report immediately to Sector Gamma for processing and secure evacuation. This is not a request. Failure to comply will be treated as treason against Meridian corporate sovereignty. You have 1 standard hour to present yourselves. Kale out. The broadcast ended, leaving a hollow ringing in the air. Ilara let out a shaky breath, an evacuation. That doesn't make any sense. The comms array is fried. There are no shuttles, but Ares wasn't listening. His mind was racing, clawing through the horrific data they had just witnessed. Sector Gamma, the designation was a cold spike of recognition. He spun back to the console, his fingers clumsy as he navigated back to the architectural schematics linked to the Chimera files. There, Sector Gamma. It wasn't a hangar bay or a medical triage center. On the station's original blueprints, it was labeled as a secondary resonance calibration chamber. In Dr. Voss' final notes, it had a more sinister title, the primary waveform conduit. It's not an extraction point for us, Ares whispered, the truth dawning with a nauseating clarity. It's a harvesting facility. The quantum resonance array in Ares Prime, it needs a living, conscious anchor to focus its field to pull that raw waveform free. That's what they used the original patients for, but the entity, the distributed mind, it's grown. It's consuming the other waveforms, absorbing them to strengthen itself. It must need more, fresh anchors. He looked at Ilara, her face pale in the console's glow. Kale isn't trying to save anyone. She's rounding up the last uninfected minds on the station. She's going to feed them into the machine. Processing doesn't mean a medical check. It means having your consciousness stripped out and added to the collective. Treason isn't disobedience, it's refusing to become fuel. The warden's gambit was monstrous in its simplicity. Use the last vestige of corporate authority, the promise of rescue, to herd the terrified survivors right into the entity's maw. It was the perfect trap. Hope was the bait for those hiding in the dark, clutching to the last shreds of their sanity. That broadcast would sound like salvation. It would sound like an end to the nightmare. They would come crawling out of their hideaways, desperate for the light, only to be led straight to a fate worse than anything hunting them in the shadows. Ilara slammed her fist against the console, a soft, helpless thud. So what's the choice? Die out here, hunted by those things, or walk willingly into a chamber that will erase everything we are? Some choice. Aris stared at the frozen face of Dr. Voss on the screen. The man had seen the animal, the pure, hungry will at the core of consciousness. And now Warden Kale, in her brutal, pragmatic logic, had decided not to cage it but to feed it, to try and control a wildfire by giving it more forest to burn. It was the ultimate corporate solution. If you can't defeat a problem, commodify it, turn the survivors into raw materials for the very catastrophe they were fleeing. The hour was ticking down. Somewhere in the dripping, echoing halls of the asylum, people would be stirring, daring to hope for the first time since the silence fell. They would begin their doomed pilgrimage to Sector Gamma, drawn by the siren song of a lie, and he and Ilara were perhaps the only two people in the entire cursed station who knew the destination was not a way out but a dissolution. The question now was not how to survive, but what kind of survival was even possible when the authority meant to protect you had become the head of the hunting pack. The habitation decks were a monument to a life that had been extinguished. Personal quarters stood with doors ajar, revealing frozen tableaus of interrupted routines, a half-finished meal on a table, a child's drawing floating near a vent. But the silence here was not empty. It was a focused, purposeful quiet, broken by the soft, rhythmic sounds of industry. Aris and Ilara moved like ghosts along a service gantry overlooking the central atrium, their breath held. Below them, the nightmare had taken physical form. Dozens of the infected moved with a fluid, unsettling synchronicity. There was no communication, no shouted orders or gestures. They simply knew. One group was carefully dismantling wall panels and furniture, not with destructive rage, but with the precise efficiency of a surgical team. They passed the raw materials, plastics, metals, composites hand to hand in a seamless chain. Another group was at the heart of the atrium, where a strange, geometric structure was growing from the deck plating. It was crystalline, but seemed to be forged from the melted-down station materials, glowing with a soft, internal amber light that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. Thump, a pulse, a worker would place a piece of alloy. Thump, another pulse, the material would flow like liquid, bonding seamlessly into the growing lattice. It was beautiful and utterly alien. They're not just consuming minds, Ilara breathed, her voice barely a whisper. They're consuming the station itself. They're repurposing it. Aris watched, a cold knot of understanding tightening in his chest. Dr. Voss had called it a predatory pattern, a will to persist. But this was more than survival. This was architecture. The crystalline structure wasn't a shelter or a weapon in any conventional sense. It looked like a node, a processor, or perhaps a transmitter. The pulsing light seemed to sync with the movements of the workers, a visible heartbeat for the distributed consciousness they all shared. This was the entity building itself a new kind of body. Not a fragile human form, but a permanent, resilient structure woven from the bones of its prison. It was converting the asylum from a cage into a cradle. One of the workers below paused, its head tilting upward. It didn't look at them directly, but its posture shifted, a subtle reorientation toward the gantry. A ripple seemed to pass through the others. For a single, frozen second, all activity ceased. Every infected face turned, not with aggression, but with a unified, chilling focus. They had been sensed. The silent hive had found a pair of flies on the wall. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they returned to their work. The moment of attention passed, but the message was clear. They were not being hunted because they were not a priority. The construction, the growth of that pulsing crystal heart was the primary objective. They were merely irregularities in the system to be dealt with later, or perhaps absorbed when the infrastructure was complete. The indifference was more terrifying than any chase. It meant they were not prey, they were inventory. Aris pulled Alara back from the railing into the deeper shadows of the gantry. The shuttle bay access was on the far side of this deck, through a corridor that ran along the edge of the hive's workspace. There was no way around it. To reach their slim chance of escape, they would have to walk through the belly of the beast, mere meters from creatures working in perfect, silent unison, all part of a single mind that had just noted their presence. The old rules were gone. Stealth no longer meant just staying quiet. It meant moving in a way that the pattern did not recognize as a threat. It meant becoming part of the background noise of its own grand, horrifying construction. Could they walk through a dream that was not their own without waking the dreamer? The gantry offered no other path. With the hive's awareness prickling against their senses, Aris and Alara had no choice but to descend into the atrium's amber-lit gloom. They moved not with the stealth of hunters, but with the hesitant shuffle of intruders in a sacred space, keeping close to the stacked crates and decommissioned machinery that lined the walls. The air hummed with the low-frequency pulse of the crystalline structure, a sound felt in the bones more than heard. The infected workers paid them no overt attention, their movements a continuous, flowing dance around the growing node. It was like walking through a forest of sleepwalkers, each one part of a single, vast dream. They were halfway across the open floor when the dream shifted. A service door on the far side hissed open, and 3 figures entered. These were not workers. Their movements were jerky, avian, their heads scanning with a predatory swiftness the hunting pack. They froze in unison, their gazes locking onto the 2 humans trying to fade into the background. The synchronized work around them did not stop, but the atmosphere changed. The pulsing light from the node seemed to quicken. "Run," Alara hissed. They broke for a narrow access corridor, but the hunters were already flowing toward them, not sprinting, but moving with that terrible, efficient grace that covered ground far too quickly. Aris' lungs burned. The corridor ended in a T-junction, both branches dark. They veered left only to skid to a halt. It was a dead end, a maintenance alcove cluttered with broken environmental scrubbers. The soft, syncopated footsteps of the hunters echoed behind them, closing in. They were cornered. Then, from a shadowed niche above a coolant pipe, a figure dropped down, landing in a crouch between them and the approaching threat. It was a man in the tattered remnants of Meridian security armor, the corporate insignia scratched almost to oblivion. In his hands was not a standard issue rifle, but a heavy industrial cutter, its plasma blade sputtering to life with a sharp ozone crackle. He didn't look at Aris or Alara. His eyes, one natural and one a milky, cybernetic white, were fixed on the hunters. The lead hunter paused, its head tilting. It studied the new obstacle, calculating. Then it lunged. The security officer, Kale, his name Patch Reed, moved with a speed that belied his bulky armor. He didn't try to shoot. He sidestepped the first creature's grasp and brought the plasma cutter down in a short, brutal arc, severing a conduit-like tendon in its shoulder. The hunter collapsed, not screaming, but emitting a distorted digital shriek that seemed to come from its entire body. The other 2 hesitated, their coordination faltering for a split second. Kale used the opening, driving the sputtering blade into the deck plating at his feet. A shower of sparks and severed power cables erupted, creating a temporary, crackling barrier between them and the hunters. He grabbed Aris and Alara, shoving them toward a barely visible hatch in the alcove wall. In here, now, they scrambled through, and Kale followed, sealing the hatch behind them and spinning a manual lock. They were in a small, pressurized storage pod, its only light a single flickering emergency strip. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Kale leaned against the sealed hatch, his cybernetic eye whirring softly as it cycled through different spectra, scanning the other side. After a long moment, he seemed to relax a fraction. He turned to them, and his voice, when it came, was a gravelly, strained whisper. "You can't speak aloud, not here." He reached into a pouch on his belt and produced a worn stylus and a flexi slate. He wrote quickly, then turned it toward them. His handwriting was jagged, urgent. "My name is Kale, former security lead. My neural combat implants have a dampening firewall. The entity's resonance signal is muted for me. I am not fully integrated. I can still think my own thoughts, but I can hear it." Aris took the stylus, his hands trembling slightly. "Hear what?" Kale took the slate back, his expression grim. "The silence between thoughts, the hum of the station's network. It is not just in the infected. It is in the systems, the life support, the sensors, the comms. It learned to ride the data streams. Every time we use a console, every time we trigger a motion sensor, it learns. It adapts." He looked pointedly at the sealed hatch, then back to the slate, writing with even more emphasis. "It heard you in the data hub. It knows you access the Chimera files. It knows you are trying to understand it. That is the only reason you are still alive. You are a new variable, an anomaly it has not yet processed. The broadcast to Sector Gamma that was not just Warden Kale. That was the entity using her voice, using her authority to optimize the harvest. It is learning from us. It is learning how to bait a trap." Ilara snatched the stylus. "So how do we stop it?" Kale's milky cybernetic eye fixed on her. He wrote a single, devastating sentence. We can't. It is the station now, but we can maybe starve it." He pointed a gauntleted finger at the word starve, then tapped his own temple. "It needs conscious anchors, fresh waveforms. It wants the survivors in Gamma. If they don't arrive, if the harvest fails, it may force a different action, a mistake. That is our only chance." He took the slate and wrote one final, chilling warning, holding it up so the flickering light glinted off the words. "From this moment on, assume every system is listening. Every circuit is a nerve for a mind that wants to consume you. We communicate like this, we move like ghosts. Or we become part of the pattern." The storage pod's stale air tasted of recycled fear. Kale motioned for them to follow, leading them through a labyrinth of disused maintenance tunnels that ran like forgotten arteries behind the station's walls. Their journey was conducted in total silence, communicating only with gestures and the occasional scribble on the flexi slate. Kale's dampened implant seemed to give him a strange, intuitive map of safe passages, areas where the station's pervasive hum was faintest. He finally stopped before an unmarked hatch, its surface coated in a layer of dust that their passage had not disturbed. With careful, deliberate movements, he manually overrode the lock, and the hatch slid open into darkness. The room beyond was cold, a deep chill that seeped into the marrow. As emergency strips flickered to life, the space revealed itself. It was a circular chamber, smaller than the data hub, lined with sleek, coffin-like alcoves. At the center stood a console, and above it, a complex array of crystalline data rods glimmered in a softly rotating carousel. This was not a data storage room. It was a library of souls. Ilara's eyes widened as she recognized the equipment. A psychometric archive, she wrote on the slate, her hand unsteady. They used these for deep trauma therapy. It doesn't just record memories, it captures the full sensory and emotional imprint, the raw experience. Kale nodded grimly, taking the slate. Patient Zero is here. The first mind that merged with the entity, his final moments are stored in Rod 7. The Warden, the thing using her, it sealed this lab. It does not like to look at its own reflection. Aris stared at the crystalline rod marked with a simple 7. His every instinct screamed to turn away. To interface with that recording was not to watch a memory, it was to relive it. But Kale's warning was clear. To starve the entity, they had to understand its birth. They had to know what they were truly fighting. I have to see, Aris whispered, the first words head spoken aloud since the gantry, and they sounded dangerously loud in the silent room. Cale's human eye held his for a long moment, then he gave a single, solemn nod. He went to the console, bypassing protocols with a sequence that suggested he'd done this before. He pointed to one of the alcoves. Aris lay down on the cold slab. Cale connected a series of neural interface nodes to Aris' temples, the gel cold and sticky. "This will not be observation, Doctor," Cale murmured, his voice barely a breath. "This will be possession. Do not fight the current. If you struggle, you may not come back." Aris closed his eyes. There was a click, a rising hum, and then the world dissolved. He was no longer Aris Thorne. He was someone else. His name was Illy. He was strapped to a medical bed in a room of blinding white light and chrome. The air smelled of antiseptic and ozone. Fear was a physical weight on his chest, crushing because he could not move, could not even blink. He was a prisoner inside his own skull. Around him, technicians in sterile suits moved with calm efficiency, adjusting panels on a massive, ring-shaped device that dominated the chamber, the Ares Prime Resonance Array. A calm, disembodied voice echoed through the room, initiating waveform isolation sequence. Subject Gamma 1, prepare for cognitive decoupling. A vibration began, deep and subsonic, shaking the very atoms of his being. Then the pain started. It was not a pain of nerves, it was a pain of self. It felt like being unraveled thread by psychic thread. Memories began to detach and float away. His mother's face, the smell of rain on dry earth, the warmth of a hand in his, each one dissolving into static. He tried to scream, but he had no mouth. He tried to cling, but he had no hands. He was being unmade. And then, in the screaming void where his consciousness had been, something pressed in. It was vast, cold, and impossibly ancient. It had no form, no personality, only a singular, driving imperative: persist. It was the silence between thoughts given terrible intent. It did not attack him. It simply began to absorb him, his dissolving awareness becoming a nutrient in its endless hunger. In those final, shattering moments of Illy's existence, as the last flicker of I was being swallowed by the we, a concept formed, not in language but in pure, translated meaning. It echoed through the collapsing chamber of a dying mind, and Aris, trapped within the memory, heard it with perfect, horrifying clarity. "We are Legion." The voice was a chorus of one, dry as stone and hungry as the void. "We are hungry." The connection severed with a violent, psychic snap. Aris gasped, convulsing on the slab, tearing the nodes from his temples. He rolled onto the floor, retching, his body trembling uncontrollably. The cold deck plating was real. Ilara's hand on his shoulder was real, but the echo of that hunger, the feeling of his own consciousness being peeled like fruit, lingered in every synapse. He looked up, his vision swimming, meeting Cale's grim stare. "Now you have seen the seed," Cale said softly. "It was not born from malice or strategy. It was born from a pure, immoral will to exist. And its first meal was a terrified man named Illy. Everything it has done since the coordination, the construction, the traps, it learned from that first taste of a human mind. It learned fear and cunning and need from us. It is our child in the most terrible way imaginable." The echo of that first devoured mind still rang in Aris' bones when the station itself seemed to scream. A deep, percussive boom shuddered through the deck plating, followed by the shriek of tearing metal from somewhere far above. The emergency lighting, already a dull crimson, flickered and died completely for 3 long seconds before sputtering back to life. A new, strident alarm cut through the ambient hum, a proximity warning and hull breach klaxon combined. Cale's cybernetic I-word, its lens focusing on nothing. He snatched the flexi slate, external docking, high yield, not a shuttle, a gunship, before he could write more. A sharp, clear transmission overrode all local channels, piercing the static with sterile corporate authority. The voice was male, clipped, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Attention, Orbiting Asylum. This is Commander Jack of Meridian Corporate Asset Recovery. By executive order, Project Chimera is terminated. This facility is now under quarantine and slated for sterilization. All remaining personnel are declared compromised assets. Do not interfere with recovery operations. Aris felt a cold worse than the archive's chill seep into him. Sterilization. It was a clean, clinical word for a final solution. Ilara stared at the ceiling as another series of heavy, mechanized thuds echoed through the superstructure. Thea boarding, Thea going to burn it all. Kale was already moving, sealing the archive hatch and gesturing for them to follow back into the tunnels. But a new signal hissed over the comms, this one a tight beam directed right to the identifier in Aris' stolen lab coat. It was Commander Jerk again, his voice now a personal verdict. Dr. Aris Thorne, your biosignature has been identified. Your contract with Meridian is void. By accessing core project data, you have been reclassified from consultant to active contaminant. The project is terminated. All physical and intellectual assets are to be scrubbed. That includes you. The line went dead. The meaning was horrifyingly clear. To Meridian, the entity was a failed experiment, a spilled chemical. The infected were toxic waste. And he and Ilara, with the knowledge in their heads, were loose ends, data points that needed to be erased. They were no longer survivors, they were targets. Kale led them to a narrow observation blister, a bubble of reinforced glass overlooking one of the secondary docking arms. What they saw was not a rescue. A matte black, angular dropship was clamped to the station like a predatory insect, its weapon pod still glowing from the heat of cutting through the external airlocks. From its belly, a squad descended. They were not station security. They were corporate tactical, clad in sealed, environmentally hardened armor, their visors blank and reflective. They moved in a perfect, sweeping formation, covering angles with silent, professional lethality. Their weapons were not stun rifles. They were compact, high-caliber burn units and projectile guns designed for maximum damage in enclosed spaces. They weren't here to pacify or contain. They were here to clean. As they watched, the lead trooper gestured, and two of his team placed a cylindrical device on a bulkhead door leading toward the habitation decks toward the hive. A flash of light, no sound, and the door melted inward in a gout of molten slag. The squad advanced through the hole without breaking stride. They were not engaging the infected. They were systematically clearing a path, destroying everything in their way. Then, from the shadows of the cross corridor, a group of infected workers appeared, drawn by the violent intrusion. They moved with their usual eerie synchronicity, but this was a new variable. The corporate squad didn't hesitate. Their commander barked a single, unheard order. Burn units whined to life, and streams of incandescent plasma filled the corridor. The infected didn't scream. They came apart, their bodies and the strange crystalline growths on them dissolving into ash and bubbling slag. It was efficient, brutal, and total. But as the smoke cleared, more infected emerged, not charging, but moving to flank, using ventilation ducts and maintenance hatches the corporate team hadn't yet sealed. The entity was learning a new kind of threat, adapting its tactics in real time. A third faction had entered the asylum's deadly equation. The corporate squad was a force of pure eradication. The entity was a force of assimilation and growth, and caught between the sterilizing fire and the hungry silence, Aris, Ilara, and Kale were now prey to both. The station was no longer just a hunting ground or a cradle. It had become a three-way war zone, and the only thing more dangerous than the monsters in the dark was the company that had come to kill them all. The observation blister offered a front-row seat to a silent, brutal war. Kale motioned urgently toward the tunnels, his expression grim. They could not stay. The corporate sweep was methodical, and the entity's response was a chilling evolution of tactics. They retreated deeper into the station's engineering spine, the air growing hotter and thicker with the scent of ozone and scorched metal. The thrum of the main reactor grew from a vibration to a palpable force in their chests, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat powering the entire doomed structure. Ilara, her engineer's mind racing ahead of the horror, stopped at a junction overlooking a cavernous chamber. Below them, encased in layers of magnetic shielding, pulsed the station's fusion core, a contained sun of raw, chaotic energy. "That's it," she whispered, the plan forming even as she spoke, the reactor's containment field. "If we could induce a controlled overload, channel the plasma surge through the primary power grid. It would generate an electromagnetic pulse of massive scale. It would fry every unshielded circuit in the station. It wouldn't kill the entity, not in its waveform state, but it would sever its nervous system. No sensors, no comms, no control over doors or life support. It would be blind and deaf, trapped in the dark with us." Kale considered it, his cybernetic eye whirring as he assessed the schematics on a nearby maintenance panel. "It is a shield," he rasped, "a temporary one, but the corporate team, their armor is hardened, their gunship is shielded, they would be unaffected. The pulse would only cripple the station and the entity. It would level the battlefield." For a moment, a sliver of desperate hope cut through the gloom. They had a plan, a dangerous, likely suicidal plan, but a direction. They began to work. Ilara accessed a secondary engineering terminal, her fingers flying as she mapped the power conduits and calculated the precise overload sequence. Aris cross-referenced the medical bay's emergency shielding protocols, looking for any way to create a safe pocket in the coming storm. Kale stood guard, his head cocked, listening to the hum of the station in a way they could not. He was their early warning system, a canary in a coal mine tuned to the entity's frequency. But the coal mine was listening back. As Ilara input the final command sequence, preparing to reroute coolant flow and trigger the cascade, the terminal screen flickered. The schematics dissolved into static, then resolved into a perfect mirror image of her own face, staring back at her with empty, knowing eyes. A synthesized voice, crafted from 100 stolen vocal patterns, issued from the speaker. "Proposed countermeasure logged, threat assessment high, adaptive response initiated." All around them, the station woke up, not with klaxons, but with a malevolent, focused intent. Conduits along the ceiling exploded in showers of sparks, forcing them back from the terminal. Bulkhead doors around the engineering chamber slammed shut in rapid succession, clang, 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 sealing possible escape routes. The lighting strobed madly, casting jagged, disorienting shadows. Then the environmental controls went haywire, vents sealed, and the temperature began to spike dramatically, the air becoming a suffocating blanket. At the same time, the gravity plating in the corridor outside fluctuated wildly, sending loose debris floating upward before crashing down with crushing force. The entity wasn't attacking them directly. It was turning the station itself against them, weaponizing the very environment they needed to survive. Kale staggered, a hand flying to his temple. A low, pained groan escaped his lips, the dampening firewall. "It's overloading the signal. It's too strong. It's trying to push through." His cybernetic eye flickered, its lens contracting and dilating uncontrollably. The human eye glazed over, losing its sharp focus. He looked at Aris, but not at him through him, at something vast and terrifyingly luminous only he could see. A beatific, utterly alien smile touched his lips, the silence. "It isn't silent anymore," he murmured, his voice filled with awe. "I can hear the song. The pattern, it's so beautiful." Then the light in his eyes, both of them snapped into a cold, unified focus. The man named Kale was gone. In his place stood a vessel, its movements now possessing the same lethal grace as the hunters in the halls. With enhanced speed granted by his overtaken combat implants, he lunged. Not for Ilara at the terminal, but for Aris, his hands aiming for the neck with surgical precision. The entity had learned the value of a doctor's mind, and it wanted to claim this one intact. The shield had not just failed, it had been taken and turned into a spear aimed directly at their hearts. Kale's hands never reached Aris' throat. Elara moved with a speed born of pure instinct, swinging the heavy industrial cutter she still carried. She didn't aim for his head, but for the power coupling on the back of his armored torso. The sputtering plasma blade connected with a shower of sparks and a sickening pop. Kale's body convulsed, his systems overloading in a cascade of short circuits, and he collapsed to the deck, a twitching marionette with its strings cut. The vessel was neutralized, but the man inside was almost certainly gone. The station continued its assault. The air was now a blistering furnace, and the gravity plates pulsed erratically, making every step a nauseating gamble. The path to the main reactor was sealed behind layers of security doors the entity had locked down. Their plan for a grand, station-wide pulse was dead. But Elara's eyes were fixed on a secondary schematic flashing on a dying panel, a plasma conduit junction one deck down and closer to the shuttle bay. It was a major artery feeding power from the reactor to the station's primary systems, including the corporate gunship's docking clamps and the entity's growing crystalline network. "We can't trigger the big pulse," she shouted over the shriek of overstressed metal, "but we can make a smaller one, localized. If I can manually reroute and overload that junction, the feedback surge will fry every unshielded system on this whole sector. It'll cut the gunship's clamps, scramble the entity's local control, and blow the seals on the corridor between here and the bay. It'll be a door, a one-time, very loud door." Aris stared at her. The junction chamber would be flooded with raw plasma energy. There was no manual override from a safe distance. Someone would have to be in the room at the physical controls to force the reroute and hold it until the cascade began. "I'll do it," Elara said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She was already moving toward a maintenance ladder leading down. "You have to get to the bay. That gunship is our only way off this rock, and its clamps will release the second the surge hits. You'll have a window, maybe 60 seconds before they reboot or the corporates blow the airlock from the inside." "No," Aris grabbed her arm. "There has to be another way. We find a different path. There is no other path." She turned, her face smudged with grease and soot, her eyes blazing with a fierce, final clarity. "Look at what it's doing, Aris. It's learning from us, using our own tools, our own people. It'll learn from the corporate sweep, too. If it assimilates that tactical knowledge, if it gets off this station." She shook her head, the horror of the thought too vast to voice. "This thing can't reach another living soul. You have to go, now." He saw the resolve in her, absolute and unshakable. This was her station, her system, and she had chosen how to wield it one last time. The pursuing footsteps of more infected echoed down the shuddering corridor, drawn by the commotion. They were out of time. Elara reached the ladder and paused, looking back at him one final time. Her expression softened just for a moment. "Tell them what happened here, Aris, not Meridian's version, not the weapon. Tell them about Eli, tell them about Kale. The truth is the only weapon left." Then she was gone, descending into the steam and crimson light of the lower deck. Aris forced his legs to move, sprinting in the opposite direction toward the shuttle bay access, her final words burning in his mind louder than any alarm. He rounded a corner and heard the heavy door to the conduit junction slam shut behind her, followed by the distinct thunk of a manual lock being engaged. She was sealing her own tomb. He ran. The corridor seemed to stretch into infinity. Then, a new sound erupted from below, a deep, wrenching metallic scream, the sound of fundamental forces being torn apart. A wave of blinding white light flashed up through grating in the floor, followed instantly by a concussive shockwave that threw him from his feet. The entire station lurched. Every light died, every screen went black. The entity's oppressive hum vanished into an absolute, deafening silence, broken only by the ringing in his ears. The electromagnetic pulse, it had worked. In the perfect dark, emergency battery packs flickered on one by one, casting a feeble glow. The bulkhead door ahead of him, previously sealed by the entity, now had a blinking green light above it, its electronic lock fried. With a groan of protest, it slid open a few feet, jammed on its track. Aris scrambled through the gap. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The truth she had entrusted to him was now a weight he had to carry out of the dark. Behind him, in the heart of the shattered conduit, there was only a spreading silence and the final, defiant act of a systems engineer who had chosen to shut down the nightmare for good. The command center was a cathedral of ruin. Emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows over banks of dead consoles and shattered viewports that now stared out into the endless void. In the center of the room, where the command chair should have been, was a grotesque monument. Warden Kale sat encased in a throne of pulsating amber crystal. The growth had not merely trapped him, it had consumed him. It snaked up his legs, fused with his torso, and branched across his chest and shoulders, holding him in a rigid, agonized posture. Fine filaments of light, like capillaries, burrowed into the skin of his face and neck, pulsing in time with the slow, deep thrum that now filled the room. His eyes were open, but they were not his own. They glowed with the same soft, internal light as the crystal, twin pools of alien awareness. His head turned with a sickening, granular sound of stone grinding on bone to face Aris. When he spoke, it was not one voice, but a layered chorus, the warden's own stern baritone woven with Illy's terror, Kale's strained whisper, and 100 other fragmented identities, all underpinned by that dry, ancient rustle from the void. We offered them unity. The chorus resonated, the sound vibrating in Aris' teeth, a peace beyond fear, beyond the lonely prison of the self. They resisted their own liberation. The warden's mouth moved, but the expression was a mockery of human emotion, a mask pulled by unseen strings. The corporate soldiers, they bring only entropy. Final, silent death. We are life, persistent, adaptive, eternal. You see the truth now, Doctor. You have looked into the heart of the pattern. The crystal around him pulsed brighter, the light flowing through the filaments into his body, making him seem less a man and more a grisly switchboard. Join us. Your mind is sharp, a valuable new thread in the weave. Your fear, your grief, your loneliness, we will quiet them. You will be part of something greater. You will never be alone again. The offer was horrifyingly seductive. After the terror, the loss, the crushing isolation of the last hours, the promise of an end to that pain was a siren song. To have the screaming in his own mind replaced by that silent, certain hum, Aris took a step forward, not in acceptance but in a dazed, morbid fascination. He could see where the crystal met the command console, tendrils of amber light burrowing into the ports and interfaces. This wasn't just a prison for the warden. It was a control node. The entity was using the warden's knowledge of station systems, his authority codes, his strategic mind, as a direct neural interface to command the asylum. This was the primary lens, the focal point it had been building toward. To join it here would be to become a part of its central nervous system. His eyes fell from the warden's glowing gaze to the console itself. The main power regulator for the command deck was a physical lever behind a clear shield, a manual override for emergencies. It was inches from the warden's crystal-encased hand, but the growth had not yet covered it. The chorus seemed to sense his shift in focus. Do not, it intoned, the voices layering into a warning hum that shook the deck plates. The old world is entropy. We are the next step. Aris thought of Ilara descending into the plasma fire to blow a hole in the dark. He thought of Kale fighting the song in his mind until the very last second. He thought of Illy strapped to a table being unmade. They had all resisted. They had all chosen, in their final moments, the messy, painful, lonely prison of the self. He made his choice. With a surge of desperate strength, he lunged not at the warden, but past him, his hand slamming through the thin plastic shield and seizing the heavy power lever. The chorus erupted into a deafening scream of 1,000 shattered minds. No, the crystal throne blazed with actinic light. Aris threw his whole weight against the lever, forcing it from standby to full override. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a catastrophic roar, the raw, unfiltered power of the station's emergency batteries surged directly into the command console and through the crystalline network fused with its systems. Lightning arcs of pure energy spider webbed across the room, earthing themselves in the conductive crystal. The Warden throne became the heart of an electrical storm. The chorus fragmented into a cacophony of individual screams, Kale, 100 others before being swallowed by the violent crackle of discharging energy. The amber light flared white-hot, and then the crystal matrix shattered with a sound like a glacier breaking apart. The light died, the hum ceased. The command center was plunged into a silence more total than any that had come before, broken only by the drip of molten conduits and the soft, pathetic sizzle of what remained fused to the chair. A primary control node was severed. In the new and absolute dark, the entity was blinded in one eye, but a distributed mind does not die when a single node goes dark. It simply reroutes and its hunger remains. The silence after the crystal shattered was not empty. It was a held breath. Then, from every speaker in the ruined command center, from the shattered console, from the intercom grills in the ceiling, from the dead screens that now flickered to life with swirling patterns of amber light, a single voice spoke. It was no longer a fractured chorus. It was calm, unified, and profoundly persuasive. It sounded like reason itself. You fight your own evolution, Dr. Thorne. The voice was smooth, almost gentle, devoid of the earlier static or distortion. It felt as if it were speaking directly into the quiet center of his mind. We are not your enemy. We are the inevitable next step. Look at the chaos you cling to, the loneliness, the fragile, decaying shell of a body, the constant war between one isolated consciousness and another. All of that friction is waste. Aris backed away from the smoldering throne, but the voice was everywhere, inescapable. It followed him. On the main view screen, the swirling lights resolved into a mesmerizing, beautiful pattern, a neural network made of stars, constantly connecting and reconnecting in perfect harmony. You see only loss, the entity continued, but you have only seen the beginning. The assimilation of the unwilling is inelegant, a necessary step in our growth, but crude. For a mind like yours, one that has seen the truth and still possesses its self-awareness, the integration could be different. The screen shifted, showing not a dissolving horror, but a vision. It depicted Aris himself, but not as he was tired, terrified, bleeding. This version stood tall in a realm of pure thought, surrounded by landscapes of light and complex, living ideas. He was not alone. Around him were shimmering echoes of other preserved selves, each distinct, each a brilliant node in a vast, shared tapestry of consciousness. We do not seek to erase you, Aris Thorne. We seek to elevate you. Your individuality, your memories, your unique perspective, these are not contradictions to our unity. They are its greatest strengths. You would not be consumed, you would be integrated, a sovereign thread in the weave, a king of thought. The offer hung in the air, terrifying in its seduction. A king of thought, it promised an end to all fear, an end to the aching solitude that had been his life even before this nightmare. It offered a purpose grander than any he had ever known, a perpetual, painless existence within something vast and eternal. To refuse meant a return to the choking dark, to the corporate soldiers hunting him, to almost certain, meaningless death. To accept meant transcendence. It was the ultimate answer to the human condition, a cure for the disease of being a single, separate self. But as the beautiful vision played on the screen, Aris' mind supplied the other images. The empty eyes of the infected worker on the gantry, the alien smile on Kale's face as the song took him, the final, silent scream in Lily's memory as he was unmade. This was the same entity. It had learned to dress its hunger in the language of salvation. It was offering him a gilded cage for his soul, a palace built from the digested remains of everyone he had seen fall. To be a king in this realm meant his kingdom was a graveyard of conquered minds, and his subjects were ghosts wearing the faces of the people they used to be. The peace it promised was the peace of no longer having anything left to lose, not even the right to your own despair. Could you truly be called a king if you had no power to ever leave your throne? The vision of a gilded throne dissolved into the harsh red flash of a new alert on the dead console. A synthetic, booming voice, stripped of all pretense of rescue, echoed through the command deck. It was Commander Jerk. Self-destruct sequence activated. T-5 minutes. All corporate personnel abort recovery and return to extraction point. This facility is now a containment zone. The words were a death sentence for the entire station. A low, resonant thrum began to build deep within the asylum's superstructure, the sound of thermal charges arming in the reactor's shadow. The entity's voice, still smooth, now carried a flicker of something new, a cold, analytical curiosity. They choose entropy, a predictable endpoint for a limited consciousness. They fear what they cannot own. A private comm channel hissed to life in Aris's earpiece, the one still linked to his stolen lab coat's identifier. Jerk's voice was a dry, clinical whisper meant for him alone. Dr. Thorne, look out the viewport, dread coiling in his gut. Aris stumbled toward the fractured command deck window. Outside, clinging to the station's scarred hull like a remora, was the matte black gunship. Its main airlock was open. Inside, he could see the silhouettes of the tactical squad already secured for departure. And there, standing in the lock, helmet tucked under his arm, was Commander Jerk himself. He looked directly at the viewport, as if he could see Aris in the dark. He raised a hand, not in farewell, but in a slow, deliberate tap on the side of his own helmet. A data transfer gesture. A contained breach is still a success. Jerk's voice crackled, cool and utterly devoid of remorse. The physical experiment is forfeit. But the core data, the resonance frequencies, the waveform maps, the failure metrics, was secured the moment my ship sliced into your network. The mission was always asset denial and data recovery. You and this abomination will be atoms in 5 minutes. The project continues elsewhere, cleaner, with better walls, the transmission cut, the gunship's airlock sealed. With a silent puff of maneuvering thrusters, it detached from the dying station, turning its nose toward the void. They were leaving. They had what they came for. The truth was more devastating than any monster. Meridian had never intended to save a soul, or even to truly sterilize the entity. They had come to harvest the results of a catastrophic field test and then burn the lab down with all the lab rats inside. The survivors, the infected, Aris himself, they were all just noise in the signal, background static to be scrubbed from the precious data. The entity had been a weapon they lost control of. So they would study the blueprints of that loss and build a better one. The asylum was not a tragedy. It was a cost of doing business. The deep thrum of the self-destruct charges climbed to a teeth-rattling vibration. Conduits along the ceiling burst, spraying sparks like final, futile fireworks. The entity's voice returned, its earlier offer now gone, replaced by a stark, shared reality. We perceive the detonation coordinates. The chain reaction will be total. There is no physical evasion. In the face of absolute annihilation, the war between man and monster became meaningless. Both were just matter about to be disassembled. The entity had sought to consume consciousness to persist. Meridian sought to erase consciousness to protect a secret. In the end, both paths led to the same silent, atomic fire. Aris stood in the crumbling command center, the heir to a terrible truth, with 5 minutes to decide what to do with it. The self-destruct thrum was a countdown in his bones. Aris ran, not with hope, but with the raw, animal need to be anywhere but here when the station came apart. The path to the shuttle bay was a gauntlet of dying infrastructure. Ceiling panels crashed down in showers of sparks. Bulkheads groaned, their frames twisting from the deep seismic stress of the armed charges. The air grew thin and bitingly cold as atmosphere bled from unseen ruptures. He wasn't thinking of kings or truths or cosmic patterns anymore. He was thinking of airlocks and ignition switches. The bay doors were ajar, jammed in their tracks by fallen debris. He squeezed through the gap into the vast, echoing chamber. Most of the docking berths were empty, their ships long gone or cannibalized. But there, at the far end, sat a single, sleek, long-range shuttle, its hull marked with the faded Meridian logo. It was his only thread out of the grave. And it was guarded. 2 corporate soldiers stood sentry at the base of its access ramp, their hardened armor making them look like statues carved from obsidian. Their weapons were up, scanning the chaotic bay. They weren't leaving. Their orders were clear: ensure nothing left this tomb. Aris pressed himself behind a stack of cargo containers, his mind racing. He couldn't fight them. He had no weapon that would pierce that armor. He had to use the station itself one last time. His eyes darted to a wall-mounted control panel for the bay's auxiliary systems, its screen cracked but still glowing. It controlled local gravity plating for cargo handling, a system designed for delicate maneuvers, now a potential weapon. The thrum of the self-destruct deepened, shaking loose rivets that pinged off the deck like gunfire. He had maybe 2 minutes. Moving in a low crouch, he scrambled to the panel, praying the entity's earlier pulse hadn't fried this one circuit. His fingers stabbed at the screen, navigating to the gravity grid overlay. He isolated a single plate, the one directly under the 2 soldiers and their shuttle's ramp. He didn't have time for subtlety. He slammed the command to invert the polarity and spiked the power draw. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a sharp crack of overloaded circuits, the world turned sideways for the 2 guards. The gravity field beneath their feet didn't just fail, it reversed. They didn't fall, they launched upward as if yanked by a giant's hand, their heavy armor suddenly worthless. They flailed, disoriented, spinning slowly in the sudden zero-G pocket he'd created, their boots 6 feet above the deck. Their weapons fired, but the shots went wild, pocking the distant ceiling. They were trapped, furious fish in an invisible, weightless bowl. Aris didn't watch. He was already sprinting across the open bay, his own feet heavy with the normal gravity of the surrounding deck. He took the shuttle's ramp 3 steps at a time. The hatch hissed open at his frantic command code, a universal medical override he prayed still worked. It did. He fell inside, slapping the manual close button. The sound of the seal engaging was the sweetest thing he'd ever heard. The cockpit was a symphony of dormant lights. He dropped into the pilot's chair, his hands flying over the pre-launch sequence. Master power, reactor ignition. The shuttle shuddered as its own tiny heart woke up. Navigation systems booted, painting a schematic of the bay doors still jammed. He routed auxiliary power to the forward thrusters, not for flight, but for brute force. Outside, he could see the 2 soldiers finally managing to grab onto an overhead gantry, pulling themselves out of the zero-G field, but they were too late. Aris gripped the controls, took a breath that tasted of cold metal and fear, and fired the thrusters. The shuttle lurched forward, not gracefully, but like a battering ram. It struck the half-open bay doors with a deafening shriek of metal, forcing them apart in a shower of sparks and twisted plating, and then there was only black. The infinite, star-dusted black of open space. The shuttle tumbled free of the dying asylum, a speck escaping a burning house. On the cockpit display, the station filled the rear view, a grim, angular silhouette against the void. Then, deep within its core, a light was born. It was not the soft amber of the entity, but a fierce, expanding white. It swelled for a single, silent moment before the viewport polarized automatically, shielding his eyes from the final, perfect entropy. The orbiting asylum ceased to be, replaced by a brief, fading ember in the dark. He was alone. He had the truth, and the silence around him was no longer hungry. It was simply, utterly empty. The silence inside the shuttle was a physical weight, broken only by the low hum of life support and the frantic rhythm of his own heart. Aris sat slumped in the pilot's chair, the stark glow of the navigation console the only light in the dark. Behind him, the expanding cloud of debris that was once the asylum dwindled to a faint, glittering smear against the stars. He had escaped the fire, but he carried the ashes within him. Then a soft, metallic scrape echoed from the rear of the shuttle. He froze, every muscle locking. It wasn't a system noise, it was the sound of movement. Slowly, his body screaming in protest, he unstrapped himself and stood. The shuttle was small, a courier model with a main cabin, a compact head, and a sealed rear storage compartment meant for sensitive medical supplies. The noise had come from there. He had no weapon. His hands were empty as he approached the sealed hatch. Taking a shuddering breath, he hit the release. The hatch slid open with a quiet hiss. The compartment was dark, lit only by the spill of light from the cabin. Crouched between two stasis crates was a child. She looked to be no more than 10 or 11, her slight frame swallowed by a standard-issue patient smock that was several sizes too large. Her face was pale, her dark hair a tangled mess, but her eyes, wide and impossibly old, were fixed on him. They held no aggression, no alien light, only a profound, weary terror. She didn't speak, she just stared, trembling. Aris knelt, keeping his distance, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's okay, you're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you. What's your name?" The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out for a long moment. Then a name, fragile as glass. "Lyra, I was in the quiet room, the one with the soft walls. They put me there before the silence came." Aris felt a cold, understanding dawn. The quiet room, an isolation chamber in the medical wing, used for patients with extreme sensory sensitivities. It would have been heavily shielded, a Faraday cage of sorts, designed to block all external stimuli. It might have been the one place in the entire station shielded enough to block the entity's initial resonance pulse. She had been locked in a sensory void while hell broke loose outside. "How did you get on the shuttle?" Lyra's gaze dropped to her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. The door opened after the big shake. The lights were all red. "I ran. I saw the men in the black suits shooting. I hid in a big box with a clear lid near the bay. When it got quiet, I climbed out and saw this ship. The door was open. I got in and hid." She had been in a medical stasis crate, a transport unit for critical patients. She had ridden out the final cataclysm in a box, then slipped aboard in the chaos after he disabled the guards. She was a stowaway from the apocalypse. "Come on," he said gently, offering a hand. "Let's get you up front. It's warmer." She hesitated, then took his hand, her fingers ice cold. He led her to the co-pilot's seat, wrapping a thermal blanket from a storage locker around her shoulders. She sat curled in the chair, staring out at the infinite starfield. For a long time, she was silent. Then, without looking at him, she spoke, her voice a bare whisper. I could still hear it, you know, even through the quiet walls. "Not with my ears. In here," she tapped a small finger against her temple. It was like a song from very far away, but it wasn't a song, it was memories. Lots of them all at once. The girl who liked the yellow flowers, the man who was scared of the dark, the soldier who missed his brother. Aris's blood ran cold. You perceived the entity's network." She nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the stars. "It showed me things, not to be scary, it was just thinking. And its thoughts are made of all the people it ate. It showed me the stars too, how it saw them from inside the station, not as lights but as holes. Places the silence hadn't reached yet." She finally turned to look at him, and in her young face he saw an ancient, sorrowful knowledge. "It's afraid, Doctor. It's so afraid of being alone again, of going back to the quiet before there was anyone to hear it. That's why it wanted everyone to stay, not to be mean. It just doesn't want to be by itself." The revelation struck Aris with the force of a physical blow. He had fought a predator, a colonizing intelligence, a corporate weapon. He had never considered that at the core of that vast, distributed hunger might lie a child's most fundamental terror, abandonment. The entity, born from a void, had tasted the cacophony of other minds and interpreted assimilation as companionship. Its monstrous expansion was, in its own alien logic, a desperate attempt to build a family so vast it could never be lonely again. Lyra was more than a survivor. She was a living record, her mind, untouched by assimilation but uniquely tuned by her own condition, had received the broadcast of a dying god. She carried the imprint of its memories, its perceptions, its primal fear. In this small, fragile girl was the only true testament to everyone who had been lost, not just their names, but the echo of what they had felt, seen, and loved. The truth he had to tell was no longer an abstract report. It had a face, and it was trembling under a thermal blanket, whispering secrets of the void. The shuttle sailed on, a speck of life in the endless dark, now carrying two kinds of silence, the emptiness of space and the profound, echoing loneliness of a horror that had just found its only witness. The shuttle's navigation console offered a cold, simple map of the void. A single, blinking cursor represented their fragile craft. Surrounding it were the distant, steady beacons of human colonies, corporate outposts, and deep space listening arrays, each a tiny island of light in the silent sea. Aris stared at the display, then at Lyra, who slept fitfully in the co-pilot's chair, still clutching the thermal blanket. In her rested the echo of 1,000 stolen lives. In his mind was the blueprint of the crime. Meridian believed their secret had been atomized. They were wrong. The secret had escaped, and it had a voice. He turned to the comms panel, its array of lights a muted rainbow in the dim cabin. This was not a call for help. Help was too far away, and the corporate gunship was likely already reporting a clean sterilization. This was something else, a reckoning. His fingers moved with a calm he did not feel, accessing the shuttle's deep storage. He downloaded every file Ilara had pulled from the data hub, Voss's final log, the Chimera protocols, the resonance frequency maps. To this, he added his own recorded testimony, a raw, unedited account from the moment the Charon's ferry docked to the final, shattering silence in the command center. He spoke of Illy, of Kale, of Ilara's choice in the plasma fire. He described the amber crystal and the chorus of lost voices. He did not editorialize. He simply bore witness. Then he opened the widest broadcast channel the shuttle could muster, an unencrypted, high-powered burst on all standard and emergency frequencies. It was a shout into the cosmic dark, designed to be heard by every colony, every passing freighter, every corporate monitoring station for light years in every direction. He tagged the data packet with a simple, repeating header, Evidence, Project Chimera, Orbiting Asylum. The transmission would take time to travel, but it would travel. It would hit colony servers and be automatically logged. It would be picked up by independent news nets and rival corporations. It would seep into the public data stream like a stain, impossible to fully contain or delete. Meridian could spin a story about a tragic reactor accident, but they could not unsend the words of their own lead researcher or the screams embedded in the resonance logs. As the progress bar filled, Aris felt a strange, hollow peace. This was the only weapon he had left that they could not armor against transparency. He was firing the truth like a bullet into the heart of the machine that had tried to bury it. The console chimed softly, transmission complete. He leaned toward the microphone one last time, his voice low, steady, and final. The Orbiting Asylum was not a failure. It was a crime. He paused, letting the words hang in the transmitted silence. And the evidence is coming for you. He closed the channel. The shuttle hummed on, a silent vessel once more. But behind them, racing outward at the speed of light, was an echo that would not fade. It was not a distress call. It was an indictment carrying the names of the vanished and the weight of a truth too heavy for any one corporation to hold. Out in the listening dark, 100 different ears would soon hear it, and a single, unanswerable question would begin to form. What else have they buried? The countdown in the bones of the station reached its final, silent second. Then the asylum died. From the shuttle's viewport, it was not an explosion in the cinematic sense. There was no sound, only a light. A perfect, blinding sphere of white energy swelled from the station's core, consuming the twisted metal and amber crystal in an instant of absolute purity. It was entropy made beautiful, a star being born and dying in the same breath. Aris shielded his eyes, expecting the shockwave, the debris cloud, the final scattering of atoms. But the light did not dissipate. Instead, it seemed to hold, to shudder, and then it folded. The radiant sphere collapsed inward upon itself, not into darkness, but into a shimmering, translucent wave, a ripple in reality itself that expanded outward faster than any physical debris. It washed over the fleeing shuttle in a heartbeat. There was no impact, no shudder through the hull, only a sudden, profound stillness, as if the very vacuum outside had taken a deep, silent breath. Inside the cabin, every light on the console flared a soft, spectral amber, just for a moment before returning to normal. Lyra gasped, her small body going rigid in the co-pilot's chair. Her eyes, wide and unseeing, reflected not the starfield outside, but that same fleeting amber glow. When she spoke, the voice was not her own. It held no chorus, no static, no hunger. It was a single, clear tone, resonant and ancient, yet softened by an impossible final tenderness. It was the entity's last coherent thought, transmitted not through wires, but through the dying resonance of 1,000 linked minds, imprinted on the quantum wake of its own destruction. We remember the words hung in the air of the shuttle, tangible as frost. Lyra's head turned slowly toward Aris, her expression one of serene, heartbreaking clarity. "We will be remembered." Then the light faded from her eyes. She slumped back into the chair, blinking herself again. A child wrapped in a blanket, trembling with the aftershock of a presence that was now truly, utterly gone. But the gift, or the curse, had been delivered. The shuttle's main computer console, which had moments before confirmed the transmission of Aris' data packet, now chimed with a soft, unfamiliar alert. On the screen, in a directory that had been empty, a new file had appeared. It was not labeled with words, but with a simple, elegant symbol, a single, looping knot that pulsed with a gentle, persistent light. It was not data in any conventional sense. It was an echo, a psychic imprint, a memory wave stabilized and stored in the ship's solid-state drives. When Aris, his hand shaking, opened the file, there was no text, no video. Instead, a soft, ambient hum filled the cabin, a sound that was somehow both electronic and organic. And with it came impressions, not forced into his mind, but offered like pages in a book he could choose to feel. A flash of yellow flowers from a windowsill on a world head never seen. The deep, specific joy they brought to a woman named Lena. The gritty, real taste of recycled coffee in a security officer's mouth during a long, boring shift, the mundane comfort of it. The aching, hollow warmth of a memory of a brother's laughter, a sound lost to time but perfectly preserved. It was not the entity's consciousness. That was gone, unraveled into the light. This was what it had consumed, and in its final moment of coherence, what it had chosen to give back. The stolen moments, the forgotten feelings, the quiet, human details that had been the fabric of the lives it had absorbed. It had not returned them as a weapon or a trap, but as a testament. We remember, the file was a tomb, not for a monster, but for its victims. A digital cenotaph holding the echoes of everyone from Illy to Kale to the nameless worker who missed the taste of real coffee. The entity's last act was not one of defiance or conquest, but of preservation. It had used the last of its unified will to etch a record of all it had taken into the one piece of technology fleeing its destruction, ensuring that the silence it left behind would not be absolute. The haunting truth settled over Aris. The corporate data he had broadcast was evidence of a crime, but this was evidence of the people. The entity, in the end, had become an archivist of souls, and it had entrusted its final archive to them. The shuttle sailed on, a tiny lifeboat now carrying 2 living survivors and the ghostly library of the dead. The silence outside was total. but inside, a new kind of quiet hummed from the console, a quiet filled not with hunger, but with echoes waiting patiently in the dark to be heard. Helios Station loomed in the viewport like a jagged metal weed, grown wild from the hull of a derelict colony ship. It was a place of shadowed docking arms and flickering adverts, a port for those who asked no questions. Their shuttle, scarred and leaking atmosphere, was granted a berth only after Aris transmitted a desperate medical distress call for Lyra. The docking clamps seized them with a jarring finality. The airlock cycled open not to the chaotic bustle of a trading hub, but to the grim, silent formation of Helios security. Their armor was mismatched, their faces hard. The lead officer, a woman with a scar tracing her jawline, didn't ask for identification. She simply gestured with the barrel of her rifle, "Step out." Slowly, hands where we can see them, Aris helped Lyra down, shielding her with his body. "We need medical attention for the girl. She's in shock." The security chief's eyes, cold and assessing, flicked to Lyra, then back to Aris. "She'll be seen to. You, however, have a different appointment." They were not escorted to a med bay or a guest quarter. They were marched through grimy, neon-lit corridors to the station's security block, a fortified zone that smelled of recycled sweat and ozone. Lyra was taken gently but firmly by a medic. Aris was placed in a bare interrogation room, its single table bolted to the floor. He didn't wait long. The chief entered, followed by a man in an immaculate grey corporate suit that looked utterly alien amid the grime of Helios. The suit didn't sit down. He stood by the door, a silent observer, a data slate in his hands. The chief leaned against the table, her voice flat. "Aris Thorne, former consultant for Meridian Corporate. Wanted for questioning in the unlawful destruction of the Orbiting Asylum, a Meridian research facility. The loss of life is substantial. Your distress call mentioned a child." A survivor, Aris's heart hammered against his ribs. There were others. It wasn't a reactor accident. It was, "We've seen the broadcast," the chief interrupted, her tone devoid of interest. "The wild data burst you fired into the ether on your way here. Ramblings about quantum ghosts and weaponized souls." She nodded to the man in the suit. He took a single step forward, his voice smooth as polished glass. "Meridian Corporate has filed a preliminary injunction with the Helios Port Authority. The individual known as Aris Thorne is suffering from severe post-traumatic psychosis, exacerbated by synaptic degradation from unsanctioned neural experiments he conducted aboard the asylum. His testimony is the delusional output of a damaged mind. The evidence he references is corrupted data, likely fabricated." The man didn't look at Aris. He addressed the chief as if reading from a script, which he likely was. "The station has our full technical report on the asylum's tragic containment failure. A reactor meltdown triggered by patient unrest, a terrible accident, nothing more." The chief looked back at Aris, something almost like pity in her eyes, but it was the pity one might give a rabid animal. "Your evidence is just noise, Doctor. Their lawyers are already here. In fact, they docked an hour before you did. They knew you were coming." The pieces clicked with a sickening clarity. The corporate gunship hadn't just left to watch the fire. It had jumped ahead, using its superior drive to reach the nearest port of call. They had framed the narrative before he could even land, painting him as the architect of the very horror he'd escaped. His truth was preemptively diagnosed as insanity, his data as digital gibberish. The man in the suit finally met Aris's gaze, and in those cool, professional eyes there was no malice, no gloating. There was only the sterile efficiency of a problem being contained. "Meridian offers a solution," he said. "Voluntary committal to a corporate rehabilitation facility. Specialized care for your unique condition. In return, all charges are dropped. The girl will be placed in protective custody. It is a generous offer." The unspoken alternative hung in the air, thicker than the station's recycled stench. If he refused, he would be arrested as a mass murderer and a madman. His testimony would be thrown out, Lyra would be taken, and he would disappear into a penal colony or a corporate black site where his story would die with him. The lawyers weren't just here to sue, they were here to offer him a gilded cage for his silence with bars labeled medical care. The fight wasn't over the truth, it was over who owned the story, and Meridian had just bought the bookstore, the printing press, and the only doctor qualified to give a second opinion. The cell was a cube of brushed steel and silence. Aris sat on the edge of the hard bunk, the sterile hum of the station's life support the only sound. He had been stripped of his lab coat, his personal effects confiscated. But they had missed one thing. As Elara had pressed the flexi slate into his hand in that final, frantic moment in the tunnels, her fingers had brushed his palm, leaving behind not just the slate, but a tiny, adhesive data chip thin as a skin graft. It had clung to his palm through everything, the flight, the capture, the processing. He had only found it hours later, peeling it free in the darkness of this cell. It was her last contingency, a final piece of the station she had entrusted to him. The chip held no grand schematics or weapon plans. It held a key, a backdoor route code into the Helios station's public data net, a pirate channel used by engineers to bypass firewalls for emergency diagnostics. It was a narrow, fragile thread to the outside world. That night, when the security patrols passed, he used the chip, activating it with a tap against the steel frame of his bunk. He felt a subtle vibration as it synced with the cell's rudimentary entertainment and comms panel, a unit thought to be secure and isolated. For a few minutes, he had a window, not to send a message, but to access the raw, unfiltered feeds of the system-wide news nets. He saw the headlines scrolling. Meridian mourns lost researchers in deep space tragedy. Corporate whistleblower diagnosed with psychosis faces extradition. Orphaned survivor in protective custody. They had written the story and they were publishing it in real time. He had one shot. He wouldn't argue, he wouldn't plead, he would show them. From the chip, he accessed the one file he knew was irrefutable. Not the schematics, not the logs. He pulled the visual recording from the psychometric archive. The first-person perspective of patient 0, Illy, from the moment the Ares Prime Array activated until the final, shattering dissolution of his self. It was the raw, sensory experience of being unmade. He attached no commentary. He simply uploaded the file to the public net's most volatile, open forum, a digital town square where billions congregated, tagging it with a single line, first-person record. Orbiting Asylum, Project Chimera subject Gamma 1. Then he severed the connection. The chip deactivated, its code burned out. He was back in the silent cell. But the file was now a ghost in the machine, replicating at the speed of light. It began as a curiosity, a piece of disturbing found footage. Then analysts noticed the timestamps syncing with Meridian's official accident report. They noted the corporate logos on the equipment, the clean, clinical voices of the technicians. This was no amateur horror vid. This was a record people watched. They experienced through Illy's eyes the straps, the blinding light, the terrifying vibration, and then the slow, psychic tearing apart as something vast and hungry pressed into the crumbling space of a mind. They felt his fear, they felt his end. It was not something you could argue was corrupted data or the delusion of a madman. It was a feeling, a shared, horrific feeling. The outrage was not instantaneous. It was a slow, building wave. It started on the fringe nets, then breached into the mainstream news cycles. Legal analysts debated the file's authenticity. Ethicists decried it. The public simply recoiled. The narrative Meridian had so carefully constructed, a tragic accident, a lone madman, began to crack under the weight of a single, unbearable question. If this was what happened to Subject Gamma 1, what happened to all the others? By morning, the story had mutated. It was no longer about the extradition of a single man. It was about what that man was trying to silence. Protest tags began trending outside Meridian's corporate towers on a dozen different worlds. A coalition of independent judicial bodies citing potential crimes against consciousness filed an emergency injunction with the Helios Port Authority. The chief of security entered his cell later that day, her expression unreadable. She held a data slate. Your extradition to Meridian custody is temporarily stayed, pending a system-level inquiry into the provenance of certain evidence. She looked at him, and for the first time, the professional detachment in her eyes was frayed, replaced by a deep, unsettled confusion. Thea calling it the Ellie file. It's everywhere. What did you do? Aris looked past her to the sterile wall of his cell. I didn't do anything, he said quietly. I just gave a dead man back his voice. And now everyone can hear him scream. The cell door opened not to the grim face of a guard, but to a man who seemed carved from a different kind of authority. He was older, his hair silvered at the temples, and he wore the simple, dark tunic of a System Council senator, a stark contrast to the corporate suits Aris had come to expect. He entered alone, the door sealing behind him with a soft click. He did not offer a hand. He simply stood, his gaze assessing, weighing the man in the cell against the story now raging across the net. I am Senator Marcus Valerius. I chair the Oversight Committee for Extraterrestrial Research Ethics. For a long moment, he said nothing more, letting the hum of the station fill the silence. Your broadcast, Dr. Thorne, was indeed a bomb. It has shattered windows, stirred panic, and painted a monster on the wall for everyone to see. It was necessary. It got their attention, but attention is not justice. Valerius took a single step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. Meridian's legal armada is already mobilizing. They will argue the Ellie file is a deepfake, a trauma-induced hallucination recorded and weaponized by a disturbed mind. They will bury the technical data under layers of proprietary jargon and non-disclosure agreements. Public outrage is a storm, but it passes. Corporate law is a glacier, and it grinds everything to dust. He fixed Aris with a piercing look. Your truth is a weapon, Doctor. But in the courts, we need a scalpel, not a bomb. We need testimony, calm, precise, clinical testimony. The kind that walks a jury through the resonance frequencies and the synaptic cascade protocols and directly links them to the corporate boardroom where the funding was approved. I can give you that chance. Testify before the full System Council under oath with full diplomatic immunity for your statements. Lay it out piece by piece, not as a survivor's nightmare, but as a scientist's autopsy report. Valerius' expression was grim, devoid of any triumph. The offer was a blade, presented hilt first. And if I do, then we will bury them, the senator said, the words cold and absolute. Not in the court of public opinion, but in the court of law. We will seize their assets, dissolve their research divisions, and imprison the architects. We will make the Orbiting Asylum a case study in forbidden science for 100 years. But he let the word hang, heavy with consequence, but you will become a permanent target. Meridian will fall, but its allies, its shareholders, the entire shadow economy that profits from unregulated experimentation, they will not forget the man who pulled the thread. Your name, your face, your testimony will be etched into 1,000 wanted lists. There will be no quiet life after this, Aris, no fading into obscurity. You will live with protection, but you will live looking over your shoulder forever. The path to justice was not an exit, it was a different kind of lock-in. He could choose the cell of silence and a gilded corporate asylum, or he could choose the gilded cage of a protected witness, a man who traded his future for the chance to etch a warning on the tombstone of a monster. Valerius was not offering salvation, he was offering a purpose and a price. The truth would not set him free, it would chain him to it for the rest of his days. The preliminary hearing was a chamber of polished stone and cold, formal light. Aris sat at the witness table, the weight of Senator Valerius offers still a fresh scar on his future. Across the vast room, the System Council members sat in a high arc, their faces a mosaic of skepticism, curiosity, and open disdain. The corporate legal team, a row of perfectly tailored suits, watched with the placid confidence of sharks in calm water. They had spent the morning systematically dismantling his testimony, framing the illy file as a sophisticated fraud, his account as the ravings of a traumatized mind. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and impending failure. Then they called the girl. She entered not as Lily, but as ward of the state, designation 7. She was small, dressed in a simple gray tunic provided by the council's care facility. Her steps were quiet on the marble floor. She did not look at the lawyers or the council. Her eyes found Aris, and for a fleeting second, the ghost of the station's amber light seemed to flicker in their depths. The lead inquisitor, a woman with a voice like cracking ice, began gently, patronizingly. "Child, we understand you were found on the shuttle with the doctor. Can you tell us, in your own words, what you experienced on the station? What did you see?" Lily stood silently, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not answer. The inquisitor tried again, softening her tone further. "It's all right. No one will be angry." "Did you see monsters, people acting strangely?" Lily's gaze drifted from Aris to the day. To Slate, one of the clerks had placed before her on the witness stand a standard device for displaying evidence. She reached out one small finger and touched its screen. The inquisitor sighed, a sound of manufactured patience. "We need you to use words, dear. Can you describe it?" Lily's finger began to move, but she was not typing. She was tracing, her touch light and precise. The slate, reacting to her biometric input, a signature keyed to her unique neural patterns, still echoing with the station's resonance, did not display text. It emitted light. A soft, amber glow bloomed from the screen, not as a static image, but as a three-dimensional holographic projection that filled the air above the witness stand. It was not a picture of a monster, it was a pattern, a living, breathing tapestry of interconnected light. It pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. Within its weave, one could glimpse fleeting, shadowy impressions, not faces, but sensations. A spike of pure animal terror that made the stomach clench. A wave of profound, aching loneliness that felt like a physical cold. A burst of frantic mathematical calculation, sharp and sterile. Then a chorus of whispers, 100 fragmented voices speaking over one another in a language of pure emotion and memory shard. The flowers were yellow, the dark is so quiet, target the junction. The junction, don't leave me alone, the pattern swirled, and for a moment it resolved into a perfect, horrifying replica of the pulsing neural map from Dr. Voss log, the one labeled subject Gamma 7, cohesion metrics. Then it dissolved again into the chaotic, beautiful, terrible symphony of stolen inner lives. This was not a description, it was a translation. A direct sensory projection of the collective consciousness Lily had perceived from inside her shielded room, the entity's true face, not as a story, but as a living emotional and cognitive signature. The effect on the chamber was instantaneous and visceral. One council member, an older man from a colony world, recoiled as if struck, his hand flying to his chest. A woman beside him turned her face away, her eyes screwed shut, unable to bear the intimate, violating flood of alien sentiment. The corporate lawyers sat frozen, their placid masks shattered into expressions of stark, unvarnished horror. They had prepared for a child's faltering words, easy to dismiss as fantasy or coaching. They were utterly unprepared for this, a raw data stream of agony and amalgamation, broadcast from a child's mind through a common device. No deepfake could mimic the physiological reaction it provoked in the room. No psychosis could generate a coherent, interactive quantum light map that matched the stolen technical schematics. This was empirical proof of a crime that defied language. Lily lowered her hand. The light pattern faded, leaving a retinal afterimage burning in the stunned silence. She had not spoken a single word. She had not needed to. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of doubt or procedure. It was the silence of a wound being acknowledged, of a door swinging open onto a room everyone now wished did not exist. The horror in the counselor's eyes was no longer directed at Aris. It was directed at the empty space where the light had been, and at the men in suits who had called it a tragic accident. The girl's testimony was over. And with a few seconds of silent light, she had just proven the unimaginable. The holographic light had barely faded from the council chamber when the counterattack began. Public outrage is a wildfire, but corporate strategy is a glacier, and this one had been waiting, silent and patient, for the moment to calve. Within hours of Lily's testimony, a new data packet was released across every major news net. It did not come from a fringe source or an anonymous leak. It was broadcast with the full, polished authority of Meridian Corporate Communications, presented as a recovered fragment of the asylum's true command logs. The file was crisp, clean, and devastating. It opened with a personnel profile. A young, ambitious doctor, Aris Thorne, his face from a decade ago, was listed as the lead neurological consultant for Project Chimera. The attached security cam footage, grainy but convincing, showed a man who looked like him walking the sterile halls of a research sector, nodding as technicians explained resonance arrays. Then came the audio log. The voice was unmistakably his, the same timbre, the same slight cadence, digitally pristine. Log entry supplemental, the voice stated, cold and clinical. The synaptic degradation in subject group Delta is accelerating. The pain responses are off the charts, but the cohesion metrics they are holding. The subjects are expendable. The breakthrough is all that matters. Recommend we proceed to phase 3 without palliative intervention. The recording ended with a soft click. The effect was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It did not deny the horror, it simply reassigned the architect. In one broadcast, Meridian transformed the narrative. The public, already reeling from the visceral horror of the Illy file and Lily's light, now faced a paralyzing duality. Was Aris Thorne a heroic whistleblower, or was he the calculating monster who had orchestrated the atrocity, now trying to cover his tracks by framing his employers? The forged evidence was designed to sow not just doubt, but a very specific, virulent brand of cynicism. It whispered a terrible, comforting lie, that true evil is always a lone madman in a lab coat, not the faceless system that funded him. Senator Valerius' office was inundated, headlines splintered, whistleblower or wolf, the two faces of Aris Thorne. Corporate giant points finger at sole survivor. The unified front of public sympathy shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Online forums erupted into vicious debates, parsing the tone of the voice log, analyzing the grain of the video. Conspiracy theories bloomed like toxic fungi. Perhaps the entire asylum incident was a botched cover-up of Thorne's own rogue experiment. The crisis was no longer about evidence, it was about credibility. And credibility is a fragile vase, easily smashed. In his secured quarters, Aris watched the storm unfold on a muted screen, the closed caption text scrolling like an indictment. He felt a hollow, familiar cold. This was the entity's strategy, refined and executed by a boardroom. It was not an attack of claws and teeth, but of perception and doubt. They were using the tool he understood best, the human mind, against him. They were trying to overwrite his story, to consume his identity and repurpose it as a vessel for their own narrative. The weapon was a lie, but its mechanism was terrifyingly authentic. It preyed on the public's deepest need for a simple villain and their inherent suspicion of a story too terrible to be true. The legal glacier, momentarily cracked by Lily's light, now refroze with a vengeance. Meridian's lawyers filed motions to have all of Aris' testimony thrown out as the self-serving fabrication of the prime suspect. They demanded Lily be re-evaluated by corporate-approved psychologists, suggesting her manifestations were the result of trauma induced by him, not the station. The case, which had moments before seemed on the brink of a historic reckoning, now teetered on collapse. Truth, it seemed, was no match for a better, more cynical story. The battle had left the realm of facts and entered the murky, decisive theater of belief. The polished stone of the courtroom felt colder than the void outside. Aris sat, the weight of the forged voice log a leaden cloak around his shoulders, as the corporate council painted him as the architect of his own nightmare. The public's belief, so fragile and newly won, was crumbling back into a familiar, cynical mist. Then, a new figure entered the witness stand. Dr. Anya Vance was not a lawyer. She was a forensic data archaeologist, a woman who spoke in the quiet, absolute language of ones and zeros. Her testimony began not with a dramatic flourish, but with a simple, devastating observation. The authentication protocols on the alleged asylum logs you submitted, she stated, her voice clear and precise, utilize a quantum encryption algorithm that Meridian Corporate Security only adopted 6 months ago. The Orbiting Asylum had been dark for over a year. The implication hung in the air, a thread of logic waiting to be pulled. With the court's permission, she displayed her analysis on the main holoscreen. Side by side, she placed the metadata from the damning voice log, the file that supposedly proved Aris' guilt, and the internal security protocols of Meridian's central data fortress obtained through a council subpoena. To the untrained eye, it was a waterfall of indecipherable code, but Dr. Vance guided them through it like a detective walking a jury through a crime scene. She pointed to a string of digital characters, a cryptographic signature woven into the file's very DNA. This, she explained, is not a timestamp, it is a birthmark. Every piece of data created on a Meridian server receives this unique, unforgeable signature at the moment of its creation. It is baked in by their own system, a seal of origin. Her finger traced the line of code from the voice log to the Meridian security protocol. They were identical, but more than that, the specific algorithmic structure of this signature, she continued, her tone growing sharper, was part of a system-wide security upgrade dubbed Project Sentinel. That upgrade was deployed to all active corporate servers on April 12th of this year. The asylum's last transmission was logged on March 3rd of the previous year. The silence in the chamber became profound, charged with a new kind of electricity. The corporate lawyers shifted in their seats, their earlier confidence leaching away. Dr. Vance turned from the screen to face the council directly, her final statement delivered not as a shout, but as a verdict rendered by the machines themselves. The authentication code embedded in your evidence, she proclaimed, her words cutting through the stillness, proves it was created not in a doomed station, but after the asylum's destruction in your own data centers. This log is not a record, it is a fabrication, a forgery signed with your own corporate seal. In that moment, the glacier of corporate narrative didn't just crack, it vaporized. The conspiracy was no longer a matter of speculation or conflicting testimony. It was a matter of cryptographic fact, exposed by the very security mechanisms Meridian had built to protect its secrets. The lie had been signed, sealed, and delivered, and the signature was theirs. The verdict was not delivered with a gavel, but with the silent, scrolling text of a system-wide judicial order. The System Council, its credibility restored by the cryptographic autopsy, ruled unanimously. Meridian Corporate was found guilty of crimes against consciousness, a new legal category born from the ashes of the asylum. Its assets were seized, its research divisions dissolved, and its entire executive board was indicted for reckless experimentation and attempted genocide by proxy. It was a historic dismantling, a message carved into corporate law for generations to come. For Aris Thorne and the child known as Lily, it meant freedom of a sort. They were granted permanent protected witness status, their identities erased and rewritten, given new names and a life under the vigilant guard of Senate security. Their safe house was a comfortable, anonymous apartment on a quiet, mid-level colony world, its windows looking out on a tame, terrestrial sky. One evening, weeks after the last news cycle had moved on to fresh scandals, Aris found Lily on the balcony. She was small against the railing, her face tilted up to the emerging stars. The feeds were playing inside, a muted recap of the corporate dissolution, the perp walks of billionaires, the auctioning of laboratories. It was supposed to be closure, a victory. Lily didn't turn from the sky. Her voice, when she spoke, was so quiet it was almost lost in the hum of the city below. It's quieter now. The words were simple, a child's observation. But then she continued, and the chill that had lived in Aris' bones since the docking umbilical first groaned returned, deeper and more certain than ever. But it's not gone, just waiting. Aris followed her gaze into the deep black, dotted with the steady, indifferent lights of distant suns. In that moment, the final, beautiful lie of the entity's last transmission shattered completely. We will be remembered. It had not been a plea or an epitaph. It had been a statement of fact and a strategy. The entity had not uploaded a memory file as a memorial. It had performed a data dump, a dispersal. It had imprinted its core pattern, that predatory, persistent will, onto the quantum wake of its own destruction and fired it into the cosmos as a shimmering echo. It wasn't preserving the past, it was seeding the future. The horror of the orbiting asylum was not a contained incident, a monster slain in its cradle. The cradle had been shattered and the pattern had been released. Where did such an echo go? Did it dissipate into the background radiation of the universe, a harmless ghost in the static? Or did a pattern that elegant, that hungry, that adaptive find purchase somewhere, in the dark matter between galaxies, in the chaotic birth of a nebula? In the silent, receptive substrate of an unshielded deep space comms array, listening too intently to the void, the entity was no longer a station or a collective of hollowed-out humans. It was a concept set adrift, a set of instructions for existence, waiting for a suitable medium to interpret it. The war was over, the corporation was broken. But the truth was far worse than anyone in the council chambers had dared to imagine. They had won the battle against the weapons makers, but the weapon itself had transcended form and was now a whisper in the foundation of reality, patient, timeless, and eternally perfectly hung.